I'm just going to do a brief summary of what I covered before. So let's see here. I'm just going to go through the slides here. So I spoke about the parallel between the res dog and First Nations communities, uh, about health, the lack of veterinary care, the lack of even human health care. Uh, we went through the mere reflection in the same way. The state of the animal is also a mere reflection of the state of the communities, poverty, lack of food and resources, services. Um, and then identifying with the res dog, my own personal experience, poverty and food. Um, and we spoke about colonization and residential school, the aftermath, the role of the dog, which has been lost in many ways, to becoming more so of a nuisance because of overpopulation. And I discussed becoming from being essential to becoming a nuisance within communities because of the overpopulation. Um, I just wanted to go over, they were once respected, but because of overpopulation, the res dog has been degraded to a near nuisance for many different reasons. Um, it is because of overpopulation, not necessarily the free roaming dog. Um, Yet we should be respectful of the dogs because of their role in our survival through our ancestors. They helped in many ways, and through this, what I've been working at is really, acknowledging our loss, striving to regain a system, and giving back to honor the dog. Um, Surely our ancestors would have never known that this would ever come to be the situation that it is today for most Indigenous communities across Canada with the over dog population. And I discussed about the marginalization, not just for Indigenous people, but how it trickles down all the way to the pets. Whether they're owned or unowned, the poverty that they also live in, just like people. Um, the the way that, let's say, some people view res dogs off the reserve, let's say, misconceptions to not being able to get veterinary care. Actually, somebody just spoke with me about how they were told that they couldn't bring their dog because of the condition of their dog to a veterinary clinic. And I really believe that it had more so to do with racism and how it can trickle down to even the dog themselves. Um, so I'm just trying to figure out. So I had also spoke about the experiences that I've had um, with situations with dogs, such as the dogs on the right or on the left, and they all ended up with a congestive heart failure, except for the puppies, and then Rex. What can happen with the lack of access to veterinary care? Thankfully, he did not die. Um, to situations where dogs, are being shot. Um, um, the two dogs here, Max and Champ, they both had X-rays done, and you know, there were buckshot still left in their bodies. Um, you know, and again, this has to do a lot with overpopulation, not necessarily the free roaming population. Um, and things such as Girl on the right, who was poisoned in that terrible situation that I had described, that I went through with the caretaker of Girl, because Girl was a stray. Um, I I don't think that I covered a lot to do with these dogs here. There's been many, but you know, being hit by cars, um, you know, having people having to surrender their pets for the lack of being able to afford veterinary care. Uh, Precious, you know, she was more so um, not necessarily, she was a stray, but somebody was caring for her. She had heartworm. Um, and Charlie here, he was a dump dog. He was not owned on the reserve. And we have a lot of people that come to dump dogs on reserves. It's a known fact. It's been happening for years. And Molly and Daisy are another example. Um, and this dog here, Wile E. Coyote, he ended up dying in the back of my van. Um, I couldn't upload videos, but you know, I rushed him to the clinic, and he didn't end up surviving. Um, so there's so many different types of such situations like this because of the lack of access and affordable vet care on reserves. And you know, most recently, I updated this presentation, and this dog here is actually on the reserve right now that we're trying to trap. Um, she has been roaming. This is about the 5th week now, and I know that it's not an owned dog. I've reached out to the community. So it's not a dog from our community. So either the dog was dumped or traveled from far off, because I also reached out to the nearby community, the Ipperwash Cottage area. Nobody so far has come forward. So we're trying to trap this dog. What I've been told is that you can see the ribs of the dog now. I don't know what the dog was dumped off like that. Um, so these are the kinds of situations that reserves also come across. And, you know, I'm hoping eventually we will trap the dog, or somebody will eventually take the dog in if we're unable to trap him or her. Apparently, the dog is very skittish, and that could be from roaming for a number of weeks now. Um, so I guess I'll go to, I guess I'll start at like the exposure and the risks. And I'm just going to briefly go over some of the PowerPoint here, just to give you an example of some of the situations. You know, the lack of being able to afford veterinary care. The dog on the right, she had pyometria a number of times. Through fundraising, we were able to get it treated in one instance, and the dog did return again, but at that point there was no funds available. Um, I I really don't know what ended up happening to this girl. I did get a call from one of the vets that had treated her before, and all I could say is that there was no funding available to help her and her family. Um, and so, you know, aside from, you know, the free roaming population, I would like to discuss, you know, like the strays, just how many strays there are in different communities, and the experiences that they have, you know, like the extreme temperatures, you know, between the summertime and the winter, and having no shelter. The weight loss that they go through by the end of the winter. you know, you're talking being able to see ribs in some instances. And that's, that's not necessarily because of, let's say, heartworm. It could just be for the lack of not having food to eat. Um, there have been instances where there have been, dogs that have died because they froze to death. Um, I have been in a situation, where there was a small breed dog that, you know, was left outside, and he ended up dying in that manner. Um, but this happens to primarily the stray population, and chain dogs, um, heat exhaustion, all of all of these terms that, I'm sure that you are all familiar with. Um, Things such as even basic skin infections have impacted families. Where I've needed to rehome animals in the past, um, for flea infestations where it's gotten out of control, and hair loss, and everything like that. And it's really hard on the families, to have to make that decision, to let their pets go, because they can't afford, um, 6 months of flea prevention, much less treatment. Um, I have had those situations, and it's very hard on me to ask people to surrender their pets in order for their pets to be looked after. I would much rather see people being able to keep their pets in their homes. Thankfully, through the veterinary clinic that we have, on my reserve, um, we have that included now in the cost, and it's affordable. And I know firsthand how thankful people are that they have even this, to be able to provide for their pets. And it also encourages people, to be able to have their pets indoors with them. Um, I know that, there are people who will keep their pets outside because of the fleas, and I totally understand that. I myself went through that with my dog, but I let my dog sleep with me, and I had bites all over my legs, and I used to pick the fleas off by hand. And it was very time consuming, but that's what I would do: bathe him, pick the fleas out, and repeat it. So just having access to these, and it just being affordable, um, um, is something, that every pet should really have. you know, and, things even like, so like Snowball. She was a dog that was abandoned on a reserve, that I was staying at, and I ended up taking her, to live with my nephew. My nephew is handicapped, and Snowball became his best friend. And my nephew walked him all the time. Sorry, walked her all the time. And one day when I was coming to visit, um, Snowball had just passed, and she had been stung. She must have been biting at the bees, and she was stung, and she ended up dying in that way, suffocating. And, you know, um, even at that point in my life, I wouldn't have been able to afford to take her to a clinic, um, to be able to have her looked after. Even things like fish hooks in the throat. There was another instance with that on another reserve. Thankfully, through the OBC, that dog was looked after, and the hook was removed. And on the way, the owner and the driver, they were keeping in contact with me, to where they were thinking that, at any moment the dog was going to die. So these are more of the experiences people have with their pets. Had it not been for the OBC covering that cost, the owner would have, gone through that experience with their dog passing in front of them and not being able to help them. So I'm going to go on. I don't want to get stuck too much on one screen, but I'll just go through Rex and Jiff. They were two dogs that were still intact, and they were looking. There was a bunch of dogs that were after one female that was still intact, and through all the male dogs fighting, Jiff ended up dying 3 days later. He didn't have access to veterinary care or the affordability. Um, and as far as, I just wanted to touch on some of the ways that people have medicated animals, tried to treat them within communities. And parvo, for one, um, I, I've heard, and through somebody that actually has used it many times, is black walnut. Um, and the other thing is with shotgun powder to treat heartworm disease. So people are trying to find ways to treat their animals in any way that they can. And I don't know what that really does to an animal's body, but I just know that with shotgun powder, if you're not careful enough, you'll end up killing the dog. And so equally accessible services. So there has not been this within First Nations communities across Canada, and the lack of affordability. So, it really spells suffering, severe distress. And you're talking about the animals and the people, and how that also contributes to human PTSD. So I was discussing a bit about, First Nations and, our history with residential schools and the intergenerational impacts that exist because of residential schools. And it's being coined intergenerational trauma. And that's only one aspect. The other aspect is what it really is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, it is chronic PTSD. And so going through these experiences with pets only adds on top of the symptoms that already exist. And I know for myself, because of the years that I've been involved with animal welfare now, that it has had an impact on me. I have gone through these experiences. All these pictures that I'm sharing are all my own experiences with animals. These animals were in my care at one point or another. Or I was involved with these animals to some degree. And I know that it has had a toll on myself, and they weren't my own animals. So I can only imagine what impact it has on the pet owner or the person looking after the strays. So having accessible veterinary services on reserves. I just want to speak about, having spay and neuter on reserves. Years ago when I first started, I would offer to take people's pets off the reserve for spay and neuter. And in the beginning, people didn't know, the reason behind it and the benefits. And, that has changed over the years for my reserve. And the reason for having accessible clinics is because, as it shows here, Kettle Point to Forest, Ontario is only about a 15-minute drive. It's 12 kilometers away, but it may as well be 100 kilometers for some people that have no vehicles, even just to find somebody to drive them with their pet or their pets. The the other issue, affordable and accessible services is, the fact that First Nations do not receive funding for any type of animal welfare service. Reserves fall under the federal government, not the provincial government, and the federal government, through the Indian Act, through the Royal Proclamation of Canada, um, um, they have a fiduciary responsibility that they created through the Royal Proclamation to care for us, and therefore that's how the Indian Act came about. And in every way, they control how money is spent, the funding that comes, and the funding that's actually there is actually through resource sharing. That's through treaties. Some people think that it's tax, people's tax paying dollars, and it's not. It's actually our money, but the federal government controls it. They hold it, and they claim that they have no fiduciary responsibility for any type of animal welfare. So reserves can't afford to pay for shelter contracts, for any type of animal control, any bylaw officers. So, it just makes the situation even more difficult, to be able to manage a population, overpopulation. Um, and so I just want to give you a little bit of insight. So about the Indian Act, it does say that, Indigenous people have the right to protect their resources, that they have the right to protect wildlife, and to provide for themselves. And so that really clearly specifies that there is a fiduciary responsibility, even for domesticated animals, because domesticated animals on reserves, for most part, are still considered, um, they fall under the wildlife, because uh, there's like no infrastructure for domesticated animals, so they still fall underneath that. In some reserves, they may have them fall under resource. They're part of the resource for things like, let's say, hunting. Um, so I'm just going to go on to, this should not be happening. We're in 2020. Um, you know, there is so much premature death, immense suffering, and premature death. In the beginning, when I used to go door to door, um, I kept track of animals, the ages of animals. And for most part, puppies uh, didn't survive. Many of them lasted to about 2 years, 2 years of age. Some of them, not all of them. Many of them didn't survive, for various reasons. And then I also noticed that there was a 4 year mark. Like it was a big deal to me when I came across animals at 4 years of age. And I see that. I see older dogs in my community now, and I know that it is because that we have had veterinary services, not where I had to, transport animals off the reserve for spay and neuter, for any kind of emergency. It's because we have accessible veterinary services now, that we are seeing the senior dogs in the communities. And that makes me very happy. Um, so this should not be happening. I want to touch a little bit about the red tape, the codes and regulations, and um, pertaining to veterinarians not being able to practice within First Nations communities without special exemption. I understand that there's a need to be careful of who enters Indigenous communities and what their intent is, and understanding, working with a vulnerable population. Yet at the same time, there are the codes and regulations I see as a form of discrimination because it has excluded First Nations within being able to have on reserve spay and neuter clinics without the exemption. Um, there was no inclusion in the decision making or the discussion when codes and regulations were created. Um, there was no consultation, no free prior informed consent. And because of the lack of veterinary services, primarily spay and neuter, there's a higher rate of dog bite instances and mauling deaths of children for the most part across Canada and Indigenous communities. Um, and, you know, if communities had easier access to on reserve, spay and neuter clinics, that rate would go down. Um, I wish that this would fall on the ears of the people that need to hear this, um, because I can't imagine, we've never had one. I can't imagine a child being mauled to death by a pack of dogs, or even one dog. And I have read a lot of articles, and I gathered a lot of information, and it's true. It's for most part it's in Indigenous communities, and a lot of the younger children, because they are outside playing, and there are a lot of strays in the different communities, to where there's many packing together and you know wild, um, not you know not just a free roaming dog that has been well socialized within the community. So these kinds of things shouldn't be happening within our communities. Um, we need to have accessible veterinary services. In Ontario alone, there's 209 reserves, and there are only 3 exemptions um, for veterinarians to be able to come to reserves to have spay and neuter clinics. And that actually is within a certain, um, uh, I guess, demographic, or within a certain area. So the codes and regulations allow, like fly-in reserves, to be able to have veterinarians come freely to those communities, but in areas that are within a 50-kilometer and 100-kilometer range, there's like a difference in this population amount per reserve. Um, they have to apply for an exemption to be able to go to a reserve, and that's not reserves saying no. That is through the codes and regulations. Um, so because of this, because of the overpopulation, you see all of these things happening to the animals, and people are witnessing them. you know um, animals being neglected, but you're talking about a stray population that is far too great for um, people to be able to afford to look after. um, of not being able to have your animals spay and neutered, and you have litters, and so then there's abandonment. Sometimes puppies just wander off, and for the lack of resources that a home might have. And that ends up adding into, you know, the intergenerational impacts of, you know, people needing to ignore the situation or turning a blind eye. And, you know, that's just the way that it is, you know. You know, people stop asking for help. um, you know, I have managed to keep on asking for help over the years, and that's what I do. I try to advocate for communities so that um, we can have equal, accessible, and affordable services. Um, so I'm going to go on to Amy Lee. So this is the first girl I started working with. She has since passed. I was able to keep in contact with her and her family. Um, um, she was adopted. She ended up coming into my care in 2010. And she lived within the city of London where I live. And Amy Lee, as you can see, she had approximately 120 to 129 pups in total from 2005 to 2010. That's when she finally got fixed. And the, the puppies you see here were from her very last litter. And the puppy on the left here, the black puppy, that puppy was from around 2007, and that was one of her earlier litters when I first started working with her. Um, Most of the puppies, you know, if they weren't in rescue, they're all gone now. Um, the one on the top right, he's still alive. I was able to find a home for him. Um, a couple from another reserve. They live in London. They had come to me looking for a dog, and that's Charlie ended up with that family. And you see Amy Lee, her teats there. That was what she looked like all the time. She never had time to really dry up to where, um, you know, she had a flat tummy again. So she ended up having about 3 litters a year. Her body got conditioned in that short period, from when she was born, 2005 to 2010. She became a super breeder. You know, I always hear vets say, oh, they have 2 litters a year. Well, there's some of these dogs out there, their bodies have gotten so used to having litter after litter that they're actually having 3 litters a year. And with that, if you can imagine, so in Ontario alone, reserves that don't have access to spay and neuter, um, you know, that was Amy Lee, you know, up to 129 in the 5 years before she got fixed. And you think about 209 reserves in Ontario alone and how much overpopulation there is. So this is Amy, you know, after she got fixed and she was rehomed. You can see she had a pretty leisurely life, and I was very happy for her because I did see her suffer. I know the stories about her puppies. You know, she had some puppies that ended up drowning in a little pool of water underneath a porch. She would move them around. You know, I can only assume trying to keep them safe. Um, I did take in a lot of the puppies to get them into rescue. And somebody that I met, you know, a number of years later after I started in animal welfare, I came to learn that she ended up with one of Amy's puppies because 3 of the puppies were picked up in the ditch. And she ended up having one of them. And so other than that, I don't know of any other puppy that Amy had that survived other than going into rescue. And so here's some pictures of some of the puppies over the years that I've picked up. Um, had they not been picked up, these puppies here are all from my reserve. When I look at these pictures, I recognize every single story. And there was many more. So, you know, our reserve has 1,000 on reserve, and half of them are children. And so had these puppies not all being rehomed, you know, on top of the animals that were already there, you could just imagine just how many more animals there would have been. Um, so I want to talk about the free roaming population, you know, escaping the life of solitary confinement versus free roaming population, not just strays. Um, you know, dogs for most part have always been outdoor dogs on reserves. You know, it was just strange for me as a child to ever think of having an animal in my home, much less my parents allowing it. I probably would have, you know, got them inside if it was my choice. But, you know, growing up, it was unheard of to have animals inside because, you know, they still have that look of, you know, they are part of wildlife. They are an animal. Um, and so it's not like you would see in the city, you know, or how people in the city have been conditioned and taught, you know, all animals should be inside. So there are, you know, there's the idea of preserving the free roaming res dog. Um, uh, People refer to it as being cultural. It's we've always had free roaming. We coined the word res dog. You know, it's not wrong for other people to use res dog, by the way. Um, so when you want to say res dog, we'll all know what you're talking about because we are the ones that came up with the name res dog. Um, and you know, the free roaming population is, you know, natural, and you know, some people, you know, look down on that, you know, about the free roaming population. Um, but if you were to come to a reserve and observe or be a part of the community, you would see the benefits of the dogs that are able to free roam. But there are the pros and cons, and just, you know, and then there's the pros and cons. Like, I can't even say it, you know, of chaining a dog. You know, it's everything's debatable here. Um, so most recently, I received a call or a message about these particular dogs. And it's something that's tabled for Chief and Council. This It was brought to my attention over a year ago. I had two separate messages about these dogs. You know, we have no uh, cruelty to animals investigation. I had been working on that before, and our reserve was moving in that direction. Uh, and you know, everything seemed like it was going to be moving ahead, but due to situations that didn't end up happening. So we're back at square one with these particular dogs here. Um, you know, I'm you know, there's the whole idea of, is something purposeful or not purposeful, as far as neglect is concerned, because you know, if people haven't had animal welfare or the knowledge of education, like even awareness, and you know, you know, what pets need may seem so basic to some people, but when you've never had that incorporated within your community, um, some of the situations aren't actually purposeful, but there are situations where, you know, animals are used just like anywhere else, used for breeding. And unfortunately, these poor dogs are left alone for days on end. And I've been told from, you know, it's not just one person and it's not just a rumor, being left for days alone. The most recent one, I was sent a video. These are screenshots of the video. No bowls, no food, no water. And then there's the DOLA. Our reserve does have the DOLA, Dog Owner Liability Act. It was adopted through the police. But unfortunately, you know, there's no means to rehome these particular animals because, you know, legally you're not supposed to even export them out of the province. Mind you, I have. I have needed to with some animals get them to a safety in another province so that they wouldn't be euthanized just for their breed. So as you can see, these guys are the one on the left there is a Staffy, and the other ones are Staffy mixes. So again, you know, speaking about, you know, provincial legislations where there's no consultation, no free prior informed consent, that ends up impacting Indigenous communities. So even if I can get this investigated somehow, the situation that these dogs are in, where are they going to go? You know, is the nearest humane society going to work to get them to safety into another province? I could definitely work on it, but I know the steps in which I would need to take to get them out of province. I have to find the rescue that would be willing to take them in. There's the cost of flying them or transporting them, you know, by vehicle. If they're flown, they have to be fully vaccinated. They have to be tested for heartworm and treated. And that's a long waiting because then you have to get a letter from the veterinarian stating that they're good to fly now, that they don't have heartworm. And that's a very long process because I've gone through it before. So I just wanted to bring that up about how Indigenous communities have been excluded from the table of any discussion when it comes to something that also impacts us and the animals. I am all for saving animals. I don't believe in the breed specific legislation at all. You know, it's not their fault that they were coined as that. So I'm just going to skip through, you know, escaping the life of solitary confinement. You know, I'm sure that everybody that's listening knows about tethering and, you know, the situation behind, you know, what it does to animals over a period of time. And I know that some reserves, they don't want the free roaming population, and I understand that with overpopulation, you know, it can be very dangerous for children. But you know, let's say in a community such as mine, you know, we have a lower population now, and for most part, you know, hands-on experience, the dogs that we have in the community are friendly. Um, they it's the ones that are chained for lengths of time that end up with the aggression issues that I have experienced over the years. I, 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 I am totally against that. I would rather see fences, you know, if animals need to be confined in some way. So I'm just going to go through the whole escaping the life of solitary confinement. These two little guys here, Blaze and Storm, they ended up being rehomed. They had a very difficult time. It wasn't a good situation. They couldn't reach the canoe to get the water. But thankfully, with working with community members and having developed relationships with people, and whatever, I guess, impact I may have had on them over the years, with animal welfare. I finally got a call, and the owner said, you know, they deserve more than this. Um, and I knew it was in her heart, and it wasn't necessarily her decision to actually have them chained. So I just wanted to share that story with you, because I know that people are trying to do the best that they can, and I think through awareness and relationships, that you know there's a better outcome, and for the animals, and owners start to see that for themselves. Um, Now the free roaming population, the pros and cons, natural behavior, they're in shape. Um, the the behavior that they have between each other is far different than when you're in the city and you're getting two dogs to meet each other, or even in like going to the leashless dog park. I mean, you have to see it for yourself, in the way that dogs introduce themselves to each other, and develop their relationships in the free roaming population. Like, they have their own little gangs. They hang out with each other. They get to decide who they hang out with, and you know, um, they have their own routines. They have their homes that they like to visit, and people look forward to having these visitors come. They get treats. They have treats for them. There's people that think that, you know when I first started out, they were like thinking that they were feeding a stray, and I'm like, oh no, that dog is owned down the road down here. It's not even necessarily a community dog. And community dog is, there's no real ownership of that particular dog, and people are looking after that animal altogether. Whereas you have other instances where, you have a free roaming dog that is owned, and he's making his way around the community. And everybody thinks that it's a stray, but really it's not a stray. And that's something else that I learned over the years, getting to know the owners and their pets, to find out actually who is owned and who is not owned. And I took collars down one year, just to test out. I want to see who these dogs are, and are they owned. And it's only one method to find out who's owned. But they were there, and people picked up collars, and next thing you know, all these dogs that didn't have collars all had collars on, roaming around. And I'm like, they are owned. And then, slowly I learned who owned what dog. You just can't assume that they're all unowned dogs roaming around the reserve, and that they're strays. So again, the free roaming population, there's the cons, and it's kind of like, which is better, you know, um, being hit by cars, um, you know, being shot or poisoned, abused, um, the not being vaccinated, um, diseases and parasites, dog fights. When animals are intact, females or males, there poses the problem. Um, but you know, I believe that there's always going to be free roaming population on reserves. I only know of one reserve where they don't allow free roaming at all, and they can afford um, an animal control officer, and it's not something that the band would otherwise be able to afford, but um, they're able to afford it because they have a casino in their community, and obviously have enough money from that to be able to afford a full-time animal control officer. And I just think that would be amazing, for many different reasons. Um, so I'm just going to skip through the cons. I'm sure everybody was able to read through um, read through that. So the community experience, communities without affordable and accessible veterinary care and other essential animal welfare services greatly impact First Nation communities as a whole. Negative effects overshadow positive experiences. In turn, the human experience with dogs is much different than off reserve, including the life experience of the res dog. I think I've covered a lot of that. You know, life would be so much different on reserves for animals and people to be able to have accessible and affordable services. And so getting started, awareness, I did a lot of awareness through different methods when I started out. And it was a lot of door-to-door, face-to-face conversations. And that is one of the biggest ways that Indigenous people have always had in communication with each other. You know, Facebook is big right now within Indigenous communities, but you know, I did the door to door, a more intimate approach to reintroducing myself into my community, but also, you know, so people could see who I am and what I'm about, and so that I can ask them questions and find out what their needs are. And you know, there was curiosity and apprehension in the beginning, you know, on the part of community members. You know, who is this person coming to my door? Especially because, you know, I left at a young age, and you know, the only people that would recognize me are, you know, family, close family members. I have a very big family. There's a lot of Brisettes and Kettle Point, and you know, it was a gradual acceptance, and now it's like fully embraced, the benefits that people have learned about for their pets. You know, it's led by the community. People share huge on reserves by word of mouth. This would stem back to oral tradition. Um, you know, if there's a good experience, everybody's going to hear about it. If there's a bad experience, they're going to hear about it even more.
Allison,
And
can I interrupt for
yeah,
just 1 second?
yeah.
Cicely has asked, whose codes and regulations are you referring to when you say that vets aren't allowed to practice on reserves? Is this the Vet Association or
So
who?
in Ontario, it's the College of Veterinarians of Ontario. So things have changed over the years. From when I first started, and when I first started learning about the codes and regulations, I didn't even know they existed. I mean, everything was so new to me. It was a Dr. Richard Herbert. Um, he was the one that explained it to me. Now, the CVO, there is a committee now that is like a, I don't know if it's like an advisory committee, but they have been working on changing the codes and regulations. And the codes and regulations are provincially legislated, so it is law. If veterinarians don't practice within those codes and regulations, they can lose their licensing. Um, you know, there was a big issue um, when the very first license was provided, the exemption, it's called an exemption. Um, and it was proposed that the reserve um, would invite veterinarians from another province to come to the community, because then the province of Ontario wouldn't have any type of jurisdiction over them. Um, and because reserves are federal, and because they are like a, we're separate nations, many nations, separate nations. Um, we have the right to invite people from other provinces, other veterinarians. And so it kind of pushed the first exemption forward, you know, because, you know, I'm sure the CVO didn't want outside veterinarians coming from other provinces to practice on the reserves in Ontario. So that's how the first one came about. Years ago, reserves couldn't even hire a veterinarian. If there was any kind of a clinic, they could only provide like an examination and consultation. They couldn't do spay and neuter, um, um, any type of surgery or anything like that. Today, the way that it's changed, Reserve can own a veterinary clinic. Um, they can own it and hire a veterinarian, or it has to be hired by a veterinarian now. And so they can do like spay and neuter clinics, or have a spay and neuter clinic. Um, and I would assume other surgeries. I haven't really looked into that because my primary focus is having, really spay and neuter clinics. That's just the first task. So the rule still stands. Let me just remember this. So the 50-kilometer rule is in order for a reserve to be able to have an on reserve spay and neuter clinic, you have to be 50 kilometers away from the nearest non-affiliated accredited veterinary clinic, and you have to have a population um, less than 700 on your reserve. Or there's the other regulation that you have to be 100 kilometers away from the nearest non-affiliated accredited veterinary clinic, with no population restriction, to be able to have on reserve spay and neuter clinic. So this exemption that exists now is so let's say the OVC, Welland Humane Society, and also Grand River Veterinary Hospital. They're the ones that hold the exemptions. So there's these exemptions now. So then you can operate within those parameters. So obviously, Kettle and Stony Point is only about you know um, 12 kilometers away from the nearest clinic, but they also need to invite the local clinics to participate when they come to our communities. And so they have been invited, and so for my reserve, Forest is involved. It's like they're the host reserve, but it is really the OVC that is coordinating everything, organizing everything. And then same with Wapool, they invited Dr. Valley and Dr. Valley's clinic, Wallaceburg Animal Hospital. They are the host, and so that's how we're working it out. And that's something that I have wanted. So then our relationship is being built with the local veterinary clinics, because it was really non-existent before that. And it's so anyways, that's about the regulations that exist.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, so awareness. Let me just see where I was. Okay, so with communities, I could very well go into my community thinking that I could do this or that, so but it's really the community that makes it work. you know um, when I first started, I'm knocking on doors and, needing to reintroduce myself. You're also talking about, the residential impacts that have been within our communities, the trust issue. So, and I'm First Nations, going to people's homes, and I really needed to build that trust relationship with people. And this is why I went door to door. And also because that's how we've always been, it's face to face, it's relationship based. And, there was apprehension, who would want to send their pet with somebody, you know, um, some stranger, I'll take your pet for a spay and neuter, and, I did get the question, am I going to get my pet back? Um, so, there's the whole residential school thing too, children being taken away. Am I going to get my child back? So there was a lot of barriers and things that, needed to be broke down. And, I really relied upon the good experiences of people. I've never heard of a bad experience with me doing, off reserve spay and neuter. Um, but it was like me relying upon people, sharing their good experiences. Or I know Allison, she's going to take good care of your pet. She took my dog or my cat. Um, and, so over the years, my community has embraced it in a huge way. I mean, like from where we were at the beginning to now, the clinics on the reserve, people are going, accessing it. They want it. Like this year, when I said, I don't think we're going to be able to, and even the year before, not knowing if we're going to have a spot, and even this fall, not knowing if we're going to have a spot to hold it, people were upset, you know, and, they really depend upon it coming to the community where they can access it and it's affordable. And it really helps. Even the relationship between people and their pets, people bragging about their pets. You never used to see that, like, this is my pet. I mean, like, I did a fundraiser the one year, and it was a calendar, and it was the OVC Community Outreach Club helped get some funding for it, for the printing with Purina. And I put it out to the community. Does anybody want your pet in the calendar? And it was to fundraise to help with emergency services. And I had so many animals that were submitted, and I was like, I can't pick and choose, I cannot. So I made this calendar and I put all of the animals in it, and I had over 60 submissions. So it was like everybody wanted their pet in there. And that was just amazing to me to see. Years before I wouldn't have had that. Um, so, and if things don't work out, you try something, it's back to the drawing board. I mean, like I tried to do like a community awareness type event in the beginning, and I invited, people, it was the Humane Society, Animal Assisted Therapy, dog trainer, dog groomer, and I had no shows. At the school, it was totally different. The kids loved it. And we would go classroom to classroom, and so, it's finding out what works for the community, what speaks to them, what their needs are, going door to door, asking, was there anything that you need, or does your pet have shelter if they're outdoor, you know, and then helping to bring that to them. Is it a lack of food, and bringing food to them? And so, the whole idea about bringing food, um, the way that I thought about it in my own childhood and everything, and knowing poverty, if I could bring pet food, then the family doesn't need to worry about meeting the need of the pet, or the money. They have that little bit extra money that they might need to hire somebody to take them to town to go to the grocery store, um, because it is a lot about whether somebody can afford food for their children or themselves and their pet. And there's many people that will sooner feed their pet than themselves, so it's kind of like bringing something to alleviate some of the stress and the worry. Um, So anyways, we'll go on to the next one. Grassroots, new concept. Everything must work simultaneously and in tandem. So while I was doing this, in the beginning, I didn't even understand why things were the way that they were. Like from my childhood up until that situation, understanding more about like the codes and regulations and the lack of spay and neuter, and just the barriers for veterinarians to be able to go to reserves to provide spay and neuter. you know um, so I was trying different ways to meet needs, and knowing that awareness is the one of the big things that you start out with. The door-to-door discussion, learning about the needs of pets, food, sharing information verbally, not giving somebody a pamphlet. It's the relationship building. I talked about the schools and the community events. Later on, the OVC Community Outreach Club, the veterinary students, they came to do, a seminar. And we had some people show up, and it was to learn more about, veterinary care. To the OVC students, they go to our public school, Hillside, each year now. I used to go, and I used to bring in different groups to talk. Shane Bateman was there one year. I used to have volunteers come, youth from the community, and we would go from classroom to classroom, and I would talk to the kids about how to keep your pet safe, and how, what can happen if you allow your pet to roam. And you know it's really different than what you would hear off the reserve. you know Children talking about their animals getting sick, um, animals being shot and hit by cars. um, I explained about males when they're intact, and how they'll fight over female dogs, and when female dogs aren't fixed. And it was actually one of a parent came to me, and she told me, I learned about spay and neuter. I think it was her grandson, um, or her son. She said he doesn't want his dog getting into dog fights, and he wants to get his dog fixed. Because I shared with them, dogs can end up dying after dog fights, and girl dogs can end up dying from being mauled to death by male dogs. So it obviously age appropriate, uh, but children are very intelligent. So it differed from classroom to classroom. I was able to talk with the older students about, I used the analogy between bullying and cruelty to animals, and about how it is for them to be bullied, and all the things that you can go through. And we discussed about things that end up happening in your home life, and I just tied it all in. And in the beginning, the kids were they were like looking around all over the place. And, I was just like, oh my goodness, how am I going to engage them and get their attention? And it's when I started speaking to them about my own experiences, and about um, things that they could really relate to. And, it's vastly different, you know, the experiences um, that kids on the reserve have experienced. And, it all ties into so many things in residential school and everything. By the end, they were all leaning forward, listening, very intently. And, you know, um, in, they were asking questions, and, it was a great experience for me. But anyways, back to the the OVC students go now, and that really helps. And I'm always looking for help because I can't do everything on my own. Um, and so this is, the whole advocacy, and this is also why I'm here talking to you all today. And so, anyways, back to the grassroots, you know, straw day, that was a big thing in my community, but now I'm branching out to other areas, different reserves now. So I'm kind of spreading myself thin. So I am looking for help. I always transported the food to my community, 4 to 5 vanfuls of pet food and supplies. Some people would pick up a load, bring it down, and it became a very big event. It went from, you know, 10 bales of straw, waving people in, and they were like, telling them that it's for their pet. And what do you mean straw for my pet? To, people coming. And, the concept was, providing, bringing, bringing those needs that I was told about that were needed by community members, bringing it to one spot, and it being obviously something social too. um, so bringing people together. Um, uh, it was also a way to teach, these are the kinds of things that your pet needs. And even in the beginning, I'm looking at some of these items and I'm going, what is that for? Because that was years ago and I had no idea a lot of the things that I know today. And in turn, parents take these items home to their children, and their children then learn from them directly. And, you know, the children learn better that way within the home than they would within a school system, let's say. Not to say that it's beneficial to have, let's say, animal welfare being taught in the school system, which I truly believe that it should have a part of it. But as far as teaching children about animal care is also teaching them about empathy and compassion, and empathy and compassion towards something outside of themselves, and and how beneficial and important that is to teach children. And it was something that was taken away during residential school. The children didn't learn that. um, so it's just another form of bringing something back, that has been missing in different ways. you know um, so I just want to go on to other things, like things that I've did over the years. So like the rehoming, so everything has to work simultaneously in tandem. So all the awareness and the rehoming of animals, and I transported animals off the reserve for 5 years. Was it 5 years? 4 years. 2014 was my last year, um, and then 2015 was the first on reserve clinic. So I was transporting animals off the reserve, for spay and neuter, and you're talking a whole van full. I mean, I have up to 24 animals, 26 animals in my van, in crates and carriers, dog in the front seat. Um, so um, having everything working together at the same time, the rehoming, the spay and neuter, um, you know, then um, then introducing things like the housing pet policy, because there's also issues within housing department, the challenges that they face. And there's also restrictions on having pets in your home if you're renting from, let's say, the band. They might have a weight restriction, um, yeah, like such as on my reserve, um, it's like 25 pounds, and then the animal has to live outside. And so I would get people shifting their animals around. They'd call me and they'd say, I'm going to get evicted. And, they would switch their animal to another home until they went through that process. And so then I would advocate on their behalf. But then there was also the need for housing, to have something in place for themselves. So working on the housing pet policy. Um, um, then we're talking about, like we're moving now into a pet first aid training and CPR. So that relationship that has been built within, like within my reserve with the OVC and in turn with the local veterinary clinic. Um, they, I was talking to them about, the aftercare and the kind of calls that I've gotten over the years, the emergency situations. And so they were going to start doing in clinic training for volunteers, but because of COVID, we can't do that right now. So it's just information sharing, literature. And so now I have 4 volunteers. Three of them are from the band, and there is one non-native person from the cottage area. Um, she has a background in spay and neuter clinics, wellness clinics down in Mexico, and so she's totally on board for helping. And the people who that are going to be in this working group, they are people that have always shown this interest, this extra interest with animal welfare. And it's also going to include the community health rep. Who her formal education was a nurse, so she was very excited about that, and working on the bylaws, trying to get the bylaw implemented and enforcement. Um, yeah, that ended up falling apart. I'm not going to get too much into that, but it was supposed to entail cruelty to animals, where outside organization, but it would also involve the police. If any calls were to come in, it would go through the police, um, and then the Humane Society would attend, that sort of thing. We were adopting the OSPCA Act. As far as I know, we were the only ones in Ontario to do that. And the whole idea behind that was, reserve bylaws are a federal law. Um, and not, so with the federal law, it's more harsh than provincial laws. And so we have, the Criminal Code of Canada and cruelty to animals could be more harsh than, let's say, the provincial law. And so the whole idea behind that was, is something necessarily should be a federal conviction on somebody's record when it was something minor. But also it was about not reinventing the wheel. So I took the OSPCA agent training, and I took it just for learning purposes, and realized that, okay, we can incorporate our bylaw and it work along with the act, so that if we needed anything that's already being tried in court, we could adopt the act to look after that particular matter, and then any other type of matter we could use the bylaw for. Um, Let me just see here, what else? Um, so I just want to get into, so talking about cruelty, is it intentional cruelty, abuse, neglect, abandonment? So is it perception or misperception? So you're talking about marginalized communities, and particularly Indigenous communities, with the whole experiences of colonization and residential school, and the impacts that that's had upon communities, and children that were taken away from their families, didn't have that nurturing within the residential school system, industrial schools, the lack of caring and love and compassion, and children returning home, ashamed of who they were because they were taught to be ashamed of who they were within these systems. Like it was wrong to be Indigenous, um, you know, and they were neglected. They were neglected within the residential school system. They were abused. Um, there's some very graphic, horrible experiences I've heard over the years, and I know myself from my own personal relationships with my family, um, the various things that have happened to them, and when you look at what that can do to a society, and you remove generations of children from their home, um, and you raise them in neglect and abuse, and I'm sure that many of them felt like they were abandoned, um, but it wasn't the decision of their parents because they were mandated to send their children to these places. Um, so, you end up with poverty in marginalized communities, never having any sort of animal welfare knowledge, resources, or services, without any kind of animal welfare. Um, Cannot afford pet food or shelter, no infrastructure, no funding. As I said, through the Royal Proclamation and then the Indian Act and the still to the government today, they control the money that is supposed to be ours. It's through resource sharing in our treaties that we have across Canada with the government of Canada, that, you know, there isn't any money for any of this for communities. The no accessible and affordable clinics, no veterinary wellness, no spay and neuter, overpopulation, dog bites, mauling deaths, cullings because they can't afford, to either, euthanize their pet at a clinic, um, or because of the overpopulation. And that's their only resort. You think about some of these reserves so far up north, there's no other means, but yet they get fingers pointed at them left and right, from rescue groups, and and just people, the animal welfare, the animal lovers, that don't have the understanding of what I'm explaining here. Um, there's a lot of the reserves, they don't have bylaws. You have a bylaw writer on a reserve, but then you're talking about, the lack of knowledge about animal welfare to even write a bylaw for animal welfare. And then there's, like, funding for training. My reserve paid for my gas to get up to the training, that I took with the OSPCA, and the OSPCA hosted me to stay for the week long training. um, but there's no other funding to send people for training for this, or to even have enforcement, um, on reserves, or to have cruelty investigation. No money for shelter contracts. So the money that's given to the reserves, like I said, they're told where it's supposed to go. So reserves will take bits and pieces. They'll take a little bit out here, a little bit out of there, and they'll try to put it together for the shelter contract. You know, um, $1,500 uh, might be a shelter contract for a certain population, within a community, but that is really hard to reach, that $1,500, when it's, you know, they have to pull it out of somewhere. Are they going to take it from human health care? Are they going to take it from education? Where are they going to take it from? Um, Really, it should be coming myself. I think to myself, there should be an aspect through, you know, um, public health and safety, um, and through wildlife, resource. But again, like I said, the the government doesn't see it as a fiduciary responsibility. Um, so and so back to the perceptions and misperceptions, and a lot of it is just you know um, outside organizations not understanding what the picture is that they're looking at. Is it really abuse and neglect that you're looking at? Is it purposeful? And I see for myself, and but also because I have that greater knowledge about our history, that pull it to I could pull it apart, and I can understand what is truly neglectful, purposeful neglect, and something else that isn't, because there has never been that knowledge there. There isn't the resources, there isn't the services, you know. And then along comes unethical rescue groups pointing fingers. They say that they start petitioning the government to stop the calls. Really, like Indigenous people can't even get clean drinking water. you know um, and then it creates a stigma, and it perpetuates racism, and it adds to the already existing systemic racism. And I've seen so many comments, let's say just on Facebook, when people post things about, a rescue group will post pictures of animals that, they had gone to a community, and they share the most graphic image. And I don't know if it's a form of getting more donations, but it creates so much racism. And I've been hurt so many times reading it. But today I understand where it comes from. It's a lack of understanding and ignorance on their part. um, um, so I'm going to go on from there. Um, so the there was a study or studies, children that witness animal abuse, whether intentional or not, there's still the same outcome. Cruelty is abuse and neglect. And what are the things that can stem from that? Domestic violence, repeated behavior of cruelty, delinquency, and antisocial behavior, incarceration, and addiction. So, you know, um, this whole big, huge picture that we're looking at, and the lack of access, and having so many animals and people in poverty, it's like a big vicious cycle. And and then you add in things like something that's not intentional neglect, but it's still impacting children in the same way psychologically. And then you talk about the state of social capital. It's a lack of resources and services. It creates poverty, stress in the home, marriage breakdown, impacts children, it affects behavior and learning, memory, disabilities, difficulty in school, creates a vicious cycle of poverty. And so you add all of this too on top of everything, and these are the kinds of things that I have thought about over the years and looked into. And it was the earlier on research that I did, because I couldn't figure out, why is this happening, and trying to figure out, how can I help, um, what needs to be added or changed, or implemented, um, and then seeing how much deeper the level is that it impacts, our communities that are already. I'm talking vulnerability, as in from residential school, the intergenerational trauma, they, the complex PTSD, and then you're adding all of this other stuff, the lack of resources and services, including all the way down to the animals, and how that adds on top of it. And if this is some way that we can do something to help try to change something for the better, then at least there's just this aspect that's alleviated. Um, from Indigenous communities, from what they're already dealing with. Um, so I'm going to go on. I don't even know what time it is, how much time I have left. I guess I'm probably up now. So I'm just going to go through. I talked a little bit about the social or psychological impacts. You can just see the things that have been highlighted, the words. And it all comes down to affecting children, by the way. Everything points back at the children, and that's what keeps the cycle going over and over and over again. And the human animal bond that relationship Indigenous people had with the dog, and the role of the dog, and how that has been shifted, changed, severed, um, destroyed in a lot of ways, but yet it can be a part of our healing. If we don't have all this dog population, they're not seen as a nuisance. If you know anything about attachment theory, you know, you know, uh, child separation from their mother, you know, um, emotional bonding and empathy, and how that all can tie into that human animal bond too, you know, go dog bites and maulings. I went through that, children living on a reserve, 180 times more likely to be killed by a dog, 20 to 200 times above those in the rest of Canada, with dog bite instances. And this is just something else that I worked on. I gathered a bunch of information that I found, fatal dog attacks in Canada, and put it all together. And the majority are children, under the age of 4. It's free roaming population and chained dogs, but it's greater in reserves than anywhere else. If you wanted a copy of it, I can send it to anybody. It's more than what I'm showing here. So we talked about the different the barriers, lack of funds, fiduciary responsibility. And we talked about the legislated codes and regulations, the racism, um, so that there's the services. This is what I'm hoping for through talking today. Partnerships with Indigenous communities, the veterinary clinics, humane societies, how humane societies can help, shelter medicine, ferals, the feral, population, dog houses, cat shelters. Greg from Toronto Humane Society was talking about manpower to help people and communities, build stuff, assistance with feral cat colonies, helping communities bylaw right, you know, um, you know, talking, teaching about the New Paws Act, which I don't even have a copy of yet. All sorts of things, fundraising, helping with euthanasia, food, reconciliation. This is all about reconciliation. That's becoming an ally with us, and helping to bring these kinds of services and resources to our communities, including us in a respectful way, talking with us, the duty to consult, consent, self-determination, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. I see all of these rescue groups clamoring to reserves, and they're doing whatever they want to do. I see some humane societies doing that. It can be a form of reconciliation, but it needs to be done in a certain way, in a respectful way. ethical. Um, what is your true intent? Do you want to be an ally? Um, Proper etiquette. You introduce yourself to chief and council, just like I did. I went to my chief, and then I went before chief and council, and I presented. This is what I want to do. These are my goals. These are my short term, and these are my long term. And that was back in 2007, and that's before I went door to door. I wasn't just going to go knocking on people's doors or going up into people's properties. you know, um, Request permission. Um, so a lot of the rescue groups that I see, I only work with a couple now, and there's other ones that, I would still work with if I needed to, and they're way beyond the London area. I only work with two of them in London. Um, but there's a lot of rescue groups that are doing this. And I want to say that there are rescue groups who are running these spay and neuter clinics that I really truly believe that veterinarians are the ones that should be organizing. Um, um, Having that direct relationship with the communities, like the OBC. Um, what happens is there's a lot of gatekeeping when it comes to rescue groups. They stay in control. The band never fully integrates that program because it's always dependent upon the rescue group. What I do is I introduce bands to the people that can come and do spay and neuter, and then they form that relationship, and it's the communities that run the clinics in conjunction with the service providers. I'm still there to help, and if a reserve still wants my help, I'm fully on board, because I know that a lot of the community health reps have a lot on their plate as it is. But there are reserves that they take it fully on, and I only share their posts when I see them, when they're going to have a clinic. you know so the whole idea is to have them have spay and neuter clinics fully integrated. I truly believe that veterinarians are the ones that should be having the direct contact with the reserves. um, there's there has been a lot of issues with various rescue groups going in, and as soon as the rescue group's done with that reserve, then there's no other relationship for the spay and neuter clinic. It's kind of holding something over somebody's head, form control. um, so I'm just going to skip through the rescue group stuff. There's been a lot of issues over the years. That's why I only work with certain rescue groups, and I would never introduce certain rescue groups to reserves. I would never invite them, because I know what everybody's doing. I do keep track of it. I know the stories from people, especially in the general area. Um, and I hear about it far beyond that, not just in southwestern Ontario. I hear about what's going on up north, and I hear what's going on, a lot out west. A lot going on in Manitoba with things that are happening in the reserves. There's no accountability, no code of conduct, pushing agendas and beliefs. There's the lack of understanding, lack of standards. Um, there's no relationship with the band. There's no integration in the community. Um, no surrender forms, no contracts, no return policy, many pop-up rescues, just people calling themselves a rescue. The one big issue that I have here is the difficulty of people getting their pets back. you know, um, Even groups, in the London area, a group, monitoring the reserves, going in and removing animals, and then saying that they found them off the reserve, and then imposing their belief on the proof of ownership, which is really, a vet record or a microchip. Otherwise, you don't get to claim your animal. Sometimes not even photos work. And so there's the disrespect about knowing how do people within First Nations community identify ownership. There's a lot of different ways to identify ownership. And it could be even somebody, a number of your neighbors vouching for you, like, oh, that's her dog. Everybody knows, that's her dog. So there's a lot of this game playing that's going on, a lot of manipulation and sneaking around and underhanded dealings with Indigenous people behind closed doors. But I ask people for their stories, and I know stories, things that, have gone on. Um, to where, even a rescue group, somebody pulling out a knife on a senior citizen at a nearby community, but no charges were ever laid because it was he said, she said kind of situation. Um, but, it was a rescue group, inviting themselves into the community for, a number of years, and they still go there. They were given a letter, a warning, only go down when you're invited. But this rescue group, they're part of, one of these other groups now, and they're still going in and removing animals. It's ridiculous. Um, and all it does is it just creates and perpetuates racism for communities. So this is going to be available for anybody that wants to see, read what I wrote. I was a token Indian at one time. That's when I first started out. Um, that's how I was used. I figured it out quickly though. um, you talk about the unprofessional way that you have to have somebody working with somebody within the community when you want to remove animals. There has to be some sort of paper trail, whether it's through the band itself, through the police. The documents need to go somewhere, or it needs to go through somebody in the community. Um, like somebody like me, animal welfare related. Um, you know, with rescue groups, when there's a surrender, puppies need to be rehomed. It always goes through me. Um, and that needs to happen to protect the vulnerable population and people that just don't understand the whole rescue world concept. Um, Shelter contracts would be great. There would be less of that. um, and so we get in, there's the res dog theft, and there's a lot of it going on. These are just some areas. It goes on in Chippewa, Montano, Oneida, close here to London, Walpole Island. This is Winnoway is like Quebec border to near Ottawa. Cross Lake, Manitoba. There's one dog that's still missing here in Barrie, on a rescue in Barrie, Ontario. It's all over Facebook, and it's a sad situation. The family finally got one family got their one dog back, but the other family hasn't gotten their dog back, and everybody's clamoring out to Manitoba. And I'm sure that many of you know that already. Everybody is jumping on the bandwagon. And my own reserve, we had a bus driver, and she's probably still doing it today, and the teacher and a male accomplice. And the teacher was given a written warning that she was going to lose her position if she didn't stop sneaking around with the children, asking children questions. The driver would keep an eye on the dogs, and the male accomplice would be the one that would be picking up the dogs along with the bus driver after her hours. There's a defunct rescue group that stole pets from James Bay area. I can just imagine how many. So we talked about soft launch, door to door, animal awareness in the schools. Um, these are all different types of fundraising. Animal awareness in the school, Solidarity Day, and we had a 10-year event, a Res Pet Fest, that was to celebrate our 10-year accomplishments within our community. Parade, lots of different type of fundraising, community events. We discussed that. There's Straw Day, OBC always coming. Um, Other animal welfare people that I know coming to volunteer, but also community members involved in volunteering. So you'll see there's the reconciliation right here, working together um, for a cause. And in the beginning it was a lot different. There was a lot of apprehension, and those barriers have been broken within my reserve, and I see it happening, or happened in Wapule. And it's a great thing to see. dog houses, schools making dog houses. You know, even Indigenous students, they have what's called Fourth R program in some of the high schools where there's a greater majority or a higher majority of Indigenous students. And so they're helping to make dog houses um, for like the reserves. We've even used like the shipping crates. Um, you know, they're not insulated, but it's better than being right completely exposed. And, you know, obviously straw and cat shelters, partnerships we talked about. Um, Partnerships is the essence with what, you know, what I try to, what I'm trying to achieve. And really, you know, I am on my own, and my team are all my partners that I've made over the years, which is the OBC and the rescue groups that I work with, and you know, the people that are there supporting me in various ways, and the volunteers. These are our clinics, and what you see is engaged communities, full participation, you know, um, community members volunteering, community members becoming advocates, um, you know, speaking out, sharing about their pets, taking pride in their pets, that human animal bond you see growing. Um, you know, it has been um, building bridges, respect, understanding relationships, true partnerships, trust, and reconciliation. And that's the end of it. I kind of went over. So, and I thank everybody for hearing me today. Um, and I hope that things that I've shared uh, um, will be implemented in some way. You know, whether it's in Indigenous communities or any vulnerable community, you know, because I know there's huge vulnerable community in London. It's so sad to see, you know, people, you know, people in poverty, you know, trying to survive, and, you know, they have pets, pets that they love.
Alison, thank you so much. It's Linda here. Steph unfortunately had to, I think, go and do a consult. We so appreciate your time and your experience, and just sharing this incredible and often shocking content with us. You're just amazing, and you are an inspiration. Um, I know we're a bit over time, but for the people who are here, I think nearly everybody has stayed. Um, do you have a couple of minutes for questions, Alison?
Oh, yes, I do.
So I'm going to leave this open in case anybody has any questions. Um, I'm not very familiar with being the host because Steph always does this job. You can't unmute yourself. I could do that for you. Just wave your hand around, and I'll see what I can do.
I think we're able to unmute ourselves. Hi, I'm
Yeah.
Kelsey Brown. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I don't have a question right now at the moment per se, but I just wanted to let you know I had sent you something in the chat. I'm not sure if you are able to see that or not, Allison. But I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not with rescue or anything, but I'm a researcher in academia, and we're just starting a project that is looking at kind of the intersection of human social justice issues and animal welfare. And we're trying to get as many voices as possible in our collaborations, and to make sure that we're kind of starting off on the right foot. And so I would love to connect with you. I put my contact in there.
Okay.
And if you're comfortable sharing yours with me, I could reach out to you via email as well. But I really loved your presentation. It's so important. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. I don't know how to get to the chat. I have a full screen right here, so I don't.
You know, Addison, I can send you that information.
Okay.
Sasha, who works with Kelsey, has already asked about that, so I can just pass on the details to you.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm not seeing more questions.
Maybe I'll jump in. I just
Yeah.
have a comment. It was interesting what you were saying, Allison, about the natural behavior of free roaming dogs
Yeah.
in communities. So I've experienced that. I have a sailboat here on Vancouver Island, and we've traveled all the way up the coast and visited lots of small First Nations communities, and seen, you know, happy, well-behaved groups of dogs wandering down the street. And, you know, and as I sail with my own dog, and he's joined in, and just like all those dogs have their social skills figured
Yes.
out. There's no fights. My dog's in heaven, and, you know, nobody's telling them to stop barking, and they just have freedom. It was
Yeah.
a wonderful experience. I was thinking, my dog is also getting a holiday. This is great. Yeah, that's a really good observation, because it's completely not the same as an off-leash dog park at all.
Yeah.
Dynamic. You just never get a chance to see it in other situations.
No.
Okay, nobody say anything. I also asked the question about the codes and regulations, and
Okay. Yeah.
I was saying it's something I'm a veterinarian, and it's in BC, and it's something I hadn't heard of. And so I'm going to follow up and just make sure that we don't have some rule like that, because that just sounds like a barrier that absolutely doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, I know that Dr. Shane Bateman and Dr. Tammy Hornack have been advocating for years to have things changed. I understand why there needs to be some, how was it explained? Like from the CVO and as far as veterinarians, to ensure that things are being done in an ethical way when veterinarians are coming to reserves. Yeah, so I totally get that. But yet at the same time, um, I, I, I mean, like there needs to be more openness to who can have the exemption to practice, to be able to, because I know that there's veterinarians that want to be able to provide their services. And you know, so like the OVC, it's all entirely volunteer. So when they have veterinarians come in to do the spay and neuter clinics and the wellness clinics, it's all volunteer. Whereas with Well and Humane Society and Dr. Tammy Hornack's exemption, they have paid staff, but they also, so the students also do help volunteer within their clinics as well. So Dr. Tammy Hornack, she goes to Six Nations and I believe still New Credit. And they go to Akwesasne, and Karen would actually know more about this than me, exactly where. I believe that Tammy used to go up to Manitoulin, and I don't know if she still does. And so, I mean, I know that there's a lot of vets out there, and maybe I don't really understand the full procedure of how veterinarians apply. But let's say, for example, there is the Canadian Animal Assistance Team, and they go out to BC all the time to do spay and neuter clinics. And I would fully trust Chris and her team to come to my community. She is somebody that has wanted to do spay and neuter in Ontario, because she does live in Ontario. um, but again, I know that there are there's unethical things that are going on, primarily with some of the rescue groups that are involved with spay and neuter clinics. And that's not to say that they all are, but there are rescue groups who have veterinarians that they work with. And that's it's tricky because I know the backgrounds of what a lot of these rescue groups are doing, and knowing that they're working with veterinarians, and the veterinarians may not know what their activities are on the reserves. And so that's why I say it should be a direct relationship with a band with the veterinarians, because that's where I find it to be most professional. I ran into so many different experiences with rescue groups over the years that I would much rather work directly with a veterinarian than rely upon a rescue group to organize something for my community, or any other community that I have, introduced any type of animal welfare to. I understand why there needs to be, like, the CVO would need to be selective. Even, not all veterinarians have an understanding of Indigenous communities, and, not all veterinarians are ethical. I mean, like, I see the different things that have happened, and there is I don't know what it's called, but there's a board that when veterinarians are doing something that they shouldn't be doing, I know that vets have lost their licensing, so I understand that. But I still believe that there are veterinarians out there that are ethical, and they would be professional in working with Indigenous communities and building those relationships. And and I started out in 2007. I learned about the codes and regulations as early as I want to say 2008, 2009. And so there has been some progress in the changes, and but I just think about what's happening within the communities and the people living the experiences and the animals that are suffering and dying, and the whole picture that you see, to me, it's a grave situation, and it shouldn't be happening. And something more needs to happen, because I've been in this now for 13 years, and there's 3 exemptions. 3 exemptions. The only ones that don't need the exemptions are the fly-in reserves, so oh, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. You really are a pioneer, and as I said, an inspiration. And I think the ripples from your work probably are more widespread than you might even realize. I also think this is a time when perhaps change and progress is really possible. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we so appreciate hearing from you, and I'm sure we'll hear more from you in the future.
And I'm grateful that I had this opportunity to share.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.